this, well, it was coming from all over the country, but a lot of this stuff, tanks and artillery and so on, was coming through Michigan. So Michigan's going to play a major role as the arsenal of democracy. And as I said, this wasn't just in the Detroit area, but what the government tried to do was to spread the involvement, because we had young men and women being conscripted, volunteering, going into military service. But then the idea was, what about other people? And they even looked at, for instance, down in Iron Mountain, they looked at old-timers, retirees that were like shoemakers. Shoemaker. Well, how could a shoemaker fit into a glider plant? You know, and the people were all caught up in the war effort. It wasn't like, well, kind of like today, we have some wars going on. People aren't tuned in to what's happening. At that time, everybody was tuned in, for sure. And they had, for instance, shoemakers would then work at the glider plant, and the gliders were made with, usually with a wooden frame and then covered in cloth, in fabric. And somebody had to sew the fabric. Well, you'd get the shoemaker who knew how to sew rough material to do the work and so on. And there's some pictures that show up with these old timers. These guys must be 70, 75 years old, working in the war effort and quite excited to be involved, to do their part and so on. The other thing that's going to happen around the state will be the development of victory gardens, and then all of the details of planting a victory garden. And victory gardens were put up in people's backyards, empty lots, and it was to produce food for yourself in your home, sustainable food supply, so that you didn't tap into the larger food supply that would be going to the troops overseas and so on. And so you're going to find that these victory gardens were all over. For instance, here in Marquette, outside to your left, in this area outside the window, a lot of that area had been used during the Depression for gardens, and then in World War II, they just continued growing crops in open fields. There were no houses out there at the time. It was just kind of an open field, and people then put fences up and grew crops out there. You also had rationing that went on. For instance, sugar would be a big item that was rationed. And in Michigan, you kind of had it's kind of a minor point, but you had a way out, a substitute for sugar. You had maple syrup or maple sugar. Not that people would sometimes get that excited. That maybe they'd still like to have sugar in their coffee and not maple syrup. But there was that intense involvement of the entire population. The other development that is going to take place in Michigan will be the introduction of prisoners of war. And we're going to have, especially after the Allied successes in North Africa, there are thousands of German prisoners of war from Rommel's Africa Corps. There are a lot of Italian prisoners of war that are caught in the defeats in North Africa. Where do you put these people? You don't send them back to Germany or Italy. Do you keep them in Africa? Do you have prisoner of war camps? What happens? So what they did was they took these prisoners of war and brought them to the United States. And according to the Articles of the Geneva Convention, it was all laid out that you could use prisoners of war because, you know, if the war is going to go on for another 4 years, what are these guys doing? And so what they did was they, in the Geneva Convention, they had a a whole program. You could use prisoners of war to work. They could not be involved in any military work, like making munitions, like working in a tank factory or something. They could work in projects that were not military based. This could get a little somewhat controversial if you really got down to nitpicking. But for instance, downstate, there were a lot of German prisoners of war that worked picking fruit and vegetables. The problem was that there was no labor force. There was a limited labor force. People were in the military. Millions of men were in the military around the country. Others have jobs, and once you were locked into a job, you didn't go floating around. You didn't have sort of a migration. Wages are better over here, and then all of a sudden one of the tank factories or munitions plant shuts down because they don't have enough workers. You couldn't do that. Once you were in a job, you had to stay. This caused some real problems in the mining areas, because when the war began, a lot of civilian workers went to Detroit and got jobs, in these booming industries. And then as time goes on, they needed miners. And there you need somebody that had the skill to work underground. You didn't just grab anybody and put them working underground. And the mine, there was I don't know how they finally settled it. It was settled, but the miners could not return to their homes in the Upper Peninsula and work in the mines because they were locked into, the Chrysler tank plant or something. And that was a bit of a problem, but they went and worked it out. But with these non-belligerent industries, there was a big demand, and you can read the newspapers from these towns, like down in Lower Michigan, West Michigan, and so on. For instance, the Gerber baby food company they were producing food for the babies. I don't know if they did a lot of production for the war effort. During the war, there was a very interesting balance you had to maintain. You didn't want, for instance, Gerber's to stop making baby food because you still had babies that needed the food. So I think they continued making just baby food. They didn't kick over to some kind of war industry. One that was kind of interesting has a connection to Michigan, kind of a stretched connection. But there was we all know Chef Boyardee. Okay, Chef Boyardee was a real person. The spelling of his name has been anglicized so that people can pronounce it. But he ran a restaurant that served pasta. People loved the sauce and would frequent his restaurant. I think he started out in Michigan, then he went to Cleveland. I think he eventually ended up in New Jersey. And during the war, he provided rations for the Army. He had a contract to provide rations. Well, rations come in a package, and they're little containers of various types of food and so on. Well, when was the last time that you bought a Chef Boyardee pizza package? He has the little box, and in the box are all the little pieces from the Army rations. I mean, the same format. So you have a package of pasta flour, you have a package of pasta sauce, you have a package of cheese, and so on. And he did the same thing with pizza, and he did the same thing with pasta. So he took the idea of Army rations of World War II, and then after the war just continued doing it, but making civilian Italian foods, and they still have them down to the present day. But there were a lot of things like that. But back to the prisoners of war. So we have these prisoners of war. What are they going to do? Okay, they worked in the picking picking the vegetables and the fruits and so on. It's kind of interesting. They were not allowed really to get involved in any kind of industry, because there you'd have a bit of a problem. What are they going to start working with tools and equipment and so on? The other thing, I remember talking to an Italian American down in Lansing. He said that a lot of I think they might have been Italian aliens. They hadn't become citizens. They were immigrants that were aliens that were working for the auto companies, and they were all fired. And the reason was not that they weren't trusted, but they were afraid that they were working in the auto company that is now producing munitions or something, and might send a letter. And they could send a letter to Italy by way of a neutral country. So you could send the letter to Portugal, or it'd be sent to Portugal, a neutral country, and then Portugal Post would send it to Italy. Well, is the guy just, writing, not a spy or anything? Is he going to mention something about, gee, we have a great production here, so on and so on, and the Italian authorities, oh, look what we have here. Let the Germans know, and so on. We have information about the interior workings of the factory. So this was a major concern. So they kept prisoners of war out of factories like that. In the Upper Peninsula, there was a big demand for woodcutters. And they wanted pulp wood for paper and so on. And they're going to, when you read the papers, and there's a big demand, and they tried to get, local workers, people that were, had regular jobs, maybe miners or something, and to try to get them to cut pulpwood at night. Well, people are tired, and they're not going to come home from work, have a bite to eat, and it's, okay, let's go out. And you have to remember, at that time, you didn't have all of the technically advanced equipment that we have today. So it was out with a saw or an axe or something, chopping wood. So there's a big demand, and what they're going to do is to bring in German prisoners of war, and there are 5 camps in the Upper Peninsula. If we go from east to west, there's Reco, over in Chippewa County, or over by Sault Ste. Marie. Let's see, Reco, there's one east of Munising, Autrain, Sidnaw, and Pori in southern Houghton County. And these were mostly the members of the Africa Corps, and they were put into the old CCC camps that were out there. These became the camps that they stayed at. There was usually a guard detachment, kind of a police detachment, guarding them. I did run across, and I do have to say that this goes back years ago when I did the original research back in the early 80s and got the story together. I found this all quite fascinating. I thought, coming from San Francisco, I grew up hearing about World War II and the defense plants and this, and this. And so then when I come to Michigan, in the middle of the country, I figure nothing's happening here, they weren't building ships for the war effort and so on. There weren't possible submarine attacks or something. But then as I got into it, I found the whole thing about the canal at Sault Ste. Marie and all of that activity. And then all of a sudden I get into the German prisoners of war. And there's about 5,000 that are here. The numbers kind of fluctuated back and forth. The Geneva Convention set the pay, the food, everything was lined up. And they were given a small amount. It's kind of interesting. They were given a small amount of money for beer, tobacco, any kind of personal needs and so on that they might have. Over and above the food and clothing and so on was provided by the government. And then at the end of the war, they were given a check, I guess a U.S. Treasury check, for work done during the war. So the lumber companies were in charge of them. They cut the wood. They had a guard there. And then they got this small remuneration for toiletries and drinks and so on. And then at the end of the war, they got a check. But then at that point, whether or not they loved the United States and wanted to stay, they had to be returned to their homeland. And then if they wanted to come back, then that was their own business. So that we weren't keeping, they didn't want to have the impression that that either side was keeping prisoners of war, continuing their imprisonment after the war. Everybody returned home. So, but the interesting thing about the prisoners of war, it was very, very low profile, very low profile. The government would not, I thought there was kind of a big thing about, well, we have German prisoners arriving and so on, and pictures taken and so on. No, it was very quietly done, and all of a sudden, gee, that camp has some lights on over there. What's going on? Oh, there's some Germans over there. And you get some, you can still run across people, they're a little older now, that were kids and remember the prisoners carving, doing a lot of wood carving. And then when around Christmas time, they would throw the carvings to the kids, a little bear or something like that. And then there was one fellow down in Trineri who was a young, well, no, I guess he was in his 20s at the time, who learned how to carve from one of the German prisoners. And when the prisoner left, he left him his carving equipment and whatnot. So they did give the prisoners some dangerous equipment. Did any of the prisoners try to escape? Yes. There were at least 2 incidents where they tried to escape. Like 2 or 3 of them were picked up by the state police somewhere out in the middle of the Seney Stretch in the winter. Okay? So you don't think about it, but this area is a good place to put prisoners because in the wintertime, where do you plan to go? And in the summertime, you're going to be eaten alive by black flies, mosquitoes, and so on. And you might say, oh, but you're hiding out, you're in the middle of the woods, and you probably don't know too much you don't know where you're going, and you don't have a map, there's no directional signals or anything, and you're just kind of wandering. So we do have the major prison in the state, the branch prison as it's known down in South Marquette. Very few escape attempts there because the people know where we go, it's like this impenetrable barrier of woods surrounding them.